In 1862, U.S. President Abraham Lincoln established a company, a railroad, and its charter was to eventually unite the east and the west ends of the United States and be able to move cargo and passengers from one end to the other and back, and bring the country closer together, spurring commerce and so on. And by 1869, crews who had started at each end of the trail, if you will, had built railroad tracks and met at Promontory Point, Utah, and there the rails matched up and they drove the Golden Spike, which was of course later pulled out and put in a museum. But the two rails had joined together, and now we had at least one at that point railroad, one path, if you will, one highway, joining or linking the two ends of the United States together. Imagine if when they started out they didn't have a standard for the distance between the rails. Such was the case in other areas of the world that were developing railroads, where different areas would have different, what we call, gauges of the rail. And in this case, imagine these crews had worked for years. They'd laid all this track and poured the gravel and leveled stuff off and driven the spikes and the whole thing. And when they got to the end and they laid the last rails, one was wider than the other. Not to mention the cars that rode on those rails would be different sizes. Nothing would have worked. So at any rate, standards have a use. Hi, this is Gary on manufacturing, with another of my occasional podcasts. And this podcast, as always, brought with support of my longtime sponsor, Inductive Automation. And just a reminder, their Ignition Community Conference will be coming up in September, not too long away. I'm recording this in June. And you can go to the Inductive Automation website and click the appropriate buttons and register for this, once again, virtual, but I'm sure it'll be very good conference. And the prime product of Inductive Automation, Ignition 8. Ignition 8 is packed with features for the modern control system, like unlimited licensing, high-powered tags, a mobile-first flexible design environment for all devices. Ignition 8 supports enterprises of any size. See all Ignition has to offer at inductiveautomation.com. Open standards, open source, open APIs, open leads to interoperability, where if you're an end user, you can put things together more easily. I can tie with an open API. I can build this app and connect to some other, if you will, application in software. Open standards, things like ISA 9588, and a whole raft of standards that came from ISA, which eventually became US standards, NIST, and eventually became IEC standards, international meaning Europe. But anyway, these standards have benefited a ton of people. ISA 95 is a standard way of talking about and building communications among different aspects of the manufacturing control system, above the physical control system, but what we typically call MES, or the MOM, Manufacturing Operations Management thing. ISA 88, standard for batch control, gave a standard language which eventually was used by the packaging industry for PackML, and became a standard way so that when a machine came into an end user, certain things were standardized, which reduced operator training and responsiveness and so on. Once again, some real business benefits coming out of open standards. Open source, another whole kind of thing, but still very valuable, is when a whole bunch of people volunteer their time, typically volunteer, to write code. Linux is used all over the place. It never made it onto the desktop. Well, I shouldn't say never, I mean, but not very popular. But it runs an awful lot of the servers of the world, amongst other things, and has become crucial to the way modern technology and the modern internet is going. Linux is an open source project, although Linus Torvalds uh, keeps control of the whole thing, but it's okay. It's not a private company doing things just for their own private gain. A lot of other open source projects going on, and you can look at the Linux Foundation for a lot of things going on, and GitHub has become a very popular repository of a number of different kinds of projects going on. And I have written about the Linux Foundation and some of the work going on there, especially the work in Internet of Things platforms. It's one. Another important way to link things together, make it interoperable without as much work as if you had to try to type proprietary stuff or just tie yourself to a certain company. The IT industry discovered a long time ago there was a great business value to this. A cynic says, a friend of mine, that one of the reasons a company would go into open source is because they get all the developers in the world doing the stuff that they can then make a profit off of. And of course that is true. I mean, you can make money off of open source. Look at Red Hat. Red Hat's a substantial company. Actually, got acquired, but that's the way of life. And it built services and products on top of open source. I heard a podcast recently with Matt Mullenweg. Matt is the founder of WordPress.org, which powers 38% of the web pages in the world on the internet. And he also is the CEO of WordPress.com. WordPress.com is a company that is built on services and products on top of WordPress.org. So on top of the open source, what you can just use, and you can for free start a blog if you want, or some sort of a web page like that on WordPress.org. But if you want a commerce platform or anti-spam or a number of other things, they sell these services and make a fair amount of profit. Matter of fact, they bought another company or started another company called Automatic. Automatic is, and Matt Mullenweg is the CEO of that also. And that's a bigger company built on all of these things. And they don't own WordPress.org, that's an open source project, but they own these companies that can make money on open source. In the IT industry, they've determined, I was sitting in a Dell meeting, I was sitting on an HPE, Hewlett Packard Enterprise meeting, and some others where they talk about donating, literally millions of lines of code to open source, and then they can, use the open source. You use it under the licenses of that open source, and but that's all fine. You can be a cynic and say, they're just trying to save a buck on development. But if you get the benefits of a community working on things where somebody sees a little need and they add some code that solves a problem, and then everybody in the community gets to use that, and the community grows, the community becomes more valuable. It's an awful lot better than trying to develop it yourself and then it's proprietary and maybe it doesn't link to anybody else. So the IT people went that way a long time ago. The industrial people are still following on this. We have built things up on the control side where everything has to be proprietary, and every company tries as hard as possible for lock-in. That I build for myself, and they'll basically just say, well, if I build it all myself, it'll connect together better and it'll give a better experience to the end user. those of us who have been end users may have a different opinion about how well everything a big company, you know, all their stuff works together. But I'm not going to dive into that any farther. I'm too far removed these days. But that's been our history, and we haven't had any history of open source and open, even open APMs and open standards have been a problem. A lot of companies have made it their goal to put an engineer on a standards committee, and the real reason is to ask millions of questions and delay things so that the standard never gets developed. We're getting a lot of end user pushback on a lot of these things, though. They're seeing the benefit of standards, the benefits of open sources. They're seeing that it future-proofs them. It keeps them from being locked into a vendor. Now, they may be happy with their vendor, but they may say, in 5 years, what happens when that vendor gets bought by somebody else and they change their policies, and all of a sudden, you know, I'm basically screwed. And what am I going to do? When it's time to upgrade, and the vendor I picked and I'm working with doesn't, you know, upgrade to the latest operating systems or technologies or whatever, and now I'm stuck, and my upgrade path sometimes is very, very expensive. Therefore, the work of the Open Process Automation Forum, part of the Open Group, trying to figure out a way to use standards and openness and interoperability to prevent that lock-in and prevent that terrible time and expense involved in upgrading when the vendor finally gets around to doing that upgrade. So what I'm hoping these days is for the new generation of engineers. I'm figuring us boomers, we were set in our way, did a lot of good work, put a lot of good things together, and a lot of that, you know, established a foundation. But the next level is going to have to be the next generation of engineers that come in with whole different training. They're not electricians who are looking at the world in a certain way. They have now not only electrical background, but control systems background and theory, and also computer science background, and they would be just as happy to sit down and do something in Python as well as ladder diagram or something like that. More familiar with open source, putting things together, working collaboratively, and some of these modern things that we've been developing, but just not getting far enough. And one of the things that concerns me a little bit, I'm a citizen and a resident in the United States, and I worked in manufacturing, trying to make a profit and trying to build companies here. And I'm seeing more and more where a lot of standards work and a lot of things that are being developed are being targeted to Europe and China first, because there's a lot more enthusiasm in Europe and China on developing and using new ideas and technologies and products and so on. I learned a long time ago that in training, in China, they were just, or Asia actually more broadly than just China, much more open to training. Europe was open to training. In the U.S., it's like, why do I need to learn any more, was so often the attitude. So I'm hoping we get this new generation that comes in, and I've seen some, and I've seen others. And the other thing I've seen in the U.S. is some real pushback from vendors that I really need my vendors to up the ante and get into this modern game and help us out, help us produce things better quality, better efficiency, better productivity, more profitably, help our companies thrive and grow. And so it's a little bit of a rant on that I really encourage you to study these things, pick them up. Using these open systems help you tremendously. They can help you get done faster. They can help you get done more efficiently, get your systems in better shape, and stay flexible and open to the future. So anyway, open. Don't be the railroad company that went to join the last two, the two rails coming from the different directions, and they built it at the wrong gauge. Think ahead. Anyway, this is Gary on manufacturing. And as always, this podcast is brought to you with the support of inductive automation. Discover a whole new view with Ignition 8, actually 8.1, by inductive automation. Packed with features for the modern control system like unlimited licensing, high-powered tags, mobile-first flexible design environment for all devices. Ignition 8 supports enterprises of any size. And believe me, I've talked to them at their conferences, the various size companies. See all Ignition has to offer at inductiveautomation.com. This is Gary Mitchell. Thanks for listening. Be safe. Have a good day.